Back off! I ain't going down like this! Drop the piece! You're surrounded! Last chance! Hands where I can see them! Drop it! You're under arrest! Back off! This is mine! You won't get away! He's bluffing! Take him!
The door they thought would hold. Harlem had its own rhythm in the late 1940s, a pulse that moved through brownstone walls, jazz-soaked basements, barbershops humming with debate, and church steps worn smooth by prayer. It was a rhythm built on survival, on dignity, on a quiet refusal to disappear. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson understood that rhythm better than most. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. His presence carried a stillness that made others measure their words. He read philosophy in the early mornings and poetry at night. He believed that a man who couldn't control his temper couldn't control his future. And in a city that often mistook noise for power, Bumpy practiced something far rarer: restraint. That restraint would be tested on a cold evening when a private social club in a neighboring district decided to make a statement. The invitation had come indirectly. A businessman from downtown, nervous hands, polished shoes, had approached Bumpy about a property dispute. The building sat on a block that was changing fast. Harlem was expanding economically, and not everyone welcomed that change. Some people preferred invisible lines to remain in place. "There's a meeting," the businessman had said carefully. "They want to discuss terms." Bumpy had watched the man's eyes instead of his words. Fear flickered there. "Who is they?" Bumpy asked. The answer came with hesitation. A heritage society, they called themselves. Men who wrapped their prejudice in tradition. Men who believed exclusion was order. Men who preferred closed doors to open conversation. Bumpy understood immediately. He also understood something else. Walking into that room would not be about business. It would be about dignity. Still, he agreed to attend. Not alone, but not with an army either. Just two trusted associates, quiet men, disciplined men, the kind who knew that strength didn't need to shout. The building stood in a district where streetlights seemed dimmer. Its windows were dark, curtains drawn tight. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and old smoke. Portraits lined the walls, faces from another era, gazes stern and unyielding. When Bumpy entered, conversation dipped but did not stop. Several men sat around a long table. Their expressions were tight with forced civility. One of them stood, tall, silver hair, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "thank you for coming." Bumpy removed his gloves slowly. "You asked for a conversation." Chairs scraped as the men shifted. Papers were placed on the table. Contracts, maps, legal documents designed to complicate ownership claims. They spoke in measured tones about community standards and preserving character. Bumpy listened. He did not interrupt. He let them talk themselves into confidence. Eventually, the tall man leaned back. "We believe," he said, "that certain boundaries are beneficial for everyone. Stability depends on knowing where one belongs." The room grew quieter. Bumpy's voice, when it came, was calm. "Belonging isn't assigned, it's earned." A flicker of irritation passed across a few faces. Negotiations stretched for nearly an hour. The terms offered were insulting, financially and morally. The implication was clear: accept limitations quietly or face resistance. Bumpy stood. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've mistaken patience for weakness." He turned toward the door. And that's when it happened. A short metallic sound, a heavy click. The door behind him had been locked. One of the men near the wall withdrew his hand from a latch. Another folded his arms. The tall man's smile returned, thin and satisfied. "We prefer," he said softly, "to conclude discussions thoroughly." The message was unmistakable. They thought isolation would intimidate him. They thought control of the room meant control of the outcome. Bumpy looked at the door, then back at them. No anger crossed his face, only assessment. Locking a door doesn't make you powerful. A few men shifted uncomfortably. The tall man spoke again. "You misunderstand. We are simply ensuring clarity." "No," Bumpy replied, "you're ensuring witnesses." The words landed differently than expected, because what those men had forgotten, what they had overlooked in their certainty, was one small detail. Bumpy Johnson never walked into a room without a plan beyond the obvious one. Outside, on the street, parked 2 buildings down, sat a car with another associate, a man instructed not to intervene unless a specific signal occurred. Bumpy believed in preparation, not paranoia. And earlier that afternoon, before attending the meeting, he had left a sealed envelope with a respected journalist in Harlem, detailing the time, location, and purpose of the gathering. A simple instruction: if he did not check in by midnight, publish the account. He had also ensured that the property documents under discussion were already filed with a legal advocacy group prepared to challenge discriminatory obstruction in court. The locked door was not a trap. It was evidence. Inside the room, tension thickened. "You think threats impress me?" one man muttered. Bumpy shook his head. "No, I think fear does." Silence fell. He stepped closer to the table, not aggressively, but deliberately. "You invited me here to intimidate me, but intimidation requires secrecy, and secrecy requires silence. You've already lost both." The tall man's composure wavered for the first time. "You're overestimating your influence." "Perhaps," Bumpy said, "but you're underestimating consequence." His gaze moved around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. Doors lock from the inside, but they also open from the inside. The difference is choice. One of the younger men near the end of the table swallowed hard. Bumpy wasn't threatening violence. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't reaching for anything except control. And control, in that moment, shifted. Because the power of prejudice often depends on reaction, on anger, on chaos, on confirming a narrative of volatility. Bumpy offered none of that. He offered composure. "You can unlock the door, or you can explain to the press tomorrow why a group of businessmen detained a guest against his will." The word detained hung heavily in the air. The tall man hesitated, then nodded slightly. The latch clicked again. The door opened. Bumpy didn't rush out. He paused at the threshold. "One small detail," he said without turning around. "Respect isn't negotiated, it's demonstrated." And then he stepped into the night air. Cool, sharp, free. On the sidewalk, his associate gave a subtle nod from the parked car. No signal had been needed. As they drove back toward Harlem, streetlights streaked across the windshield. The city felt different. Not safer, not softer, but clearer. Conflict had not been avoided. It had been reframed. Back in Harlem, word traveled quickly. Not through newspapers, yet, but through conversations, through barbershops, through church basements, through quiet acknowledgments that someone had refused humiliation without resorting to violence. Bumpy sat alone later that evening in his study, a book of philosophy open on his desk. He reread a line he had underlined months earlier. "He who conquers himself is the mightiest warrior." He closed the book gently. The locked door was not the real test.
The real test was the temptation to respond emotionally, to validate the expectations placed upon him. He had chosen differently. And somewhere across the city, in a building with drawn curtains, a group of men realized something unsettling. They had tried to isolate a man. Instead, they had strengthened his position. They had locked the door behind Bumpy Johnson, but they forgot one small detail. He never walked alone in spirit, and he never confused restraint with surrender. The story was not over, not by a long shot.
The night after the meeting did not end with celebration, and it did not end with retaliation. It ended with strategy. Harlem had learned through hard experience that emotional reactions often cost more than calculated responses. When Bumpy returned to his neighborhood, he did not call for confrontation, nor did he allow rumors to spiral into reckless talk. Instead, he requested conversations, measured, intentional conversations with pastors, shop owners, legal advisors, and community leaders who understood that real power is built through structure, not spectacle. The locked door incident was not just an insult to one man. It was a symbolic attempt to reinforce invisible boundaries. And symbols, Bumpy knew, must be answered with stronger symbols, rooted in dignity and lawful resolve. He gathered those closest to him in the back room of a small business on 135th Street, the air thick with tobacco and anticipation, and he spoke not of revenge, but of leverage. He explained calmly that their strength would not come from matching hostility with hostility, but from exposing weakness through unity. He reminded them that prejudice survives in darkness, but falters under scrutiny. And scrutiny requires patience, documentation, and discipline. He had already ensured that the attempted detention was recorded through sworn statements and corroborated timelines, not exaggerated stories, but clear facts. The men in that private club had assumed isolation would silence him. Instead, their behavior would now become a public example of insecurity masquerading as authority. Over the next week, Harlem did something powerful. It refused to react emotionally. Businesses continued operating, churches continued gathering, families continued living. But behind the scenes, legal notices were filed, property claims were reinforced, and economic partnerships were strengthened in a way that made obstruction increasingly expensive. Bumpy met with a civil rights attorney who specialized in discriminatory interference cases, and together they constructed a strategy designed not to provoke, but to protect. If any further attempts were made to block development through intimidation, the response would be legal, visible, and documented. Meanwhile, a respected journalist quietly began drafting an article, not inflammatory, not dramatic, but factual, about the importance of equitable business practices in expanding neighborhoods. Names were not yet mentioned, but the implications were unmistakable. Pressure built not through threats, but through awareness, and awareness is difficult to contain. Word reached the men who had locked the door that their actions were no longer private. They had expected outrage. Instead, they encountered organization. They had anticipated anger. Instead, they faced composure. The tall, silver-haired leader began receiving inquiries from associates who disliked unwanted attention. Investors prefer stability, and nothing disrupts stability faster than public scrutiny. What unsettled them most was not confrontation, but the absence of it. They could not label Bumpy as volatile. They could not accuse him of disorder. He had given them nothing to distort. In Harlem, young men who once equated strength with physical dominance began to see another model unfolding before them. They watched as their community responded to insult with structure and to exclusion with preparation. Bumpy visited a local school one afternoon, speaking briefly about discipline and long-term thinking, emphasizing that dignity is not defended through chaos, but through clarity. He did not mention the locked door directly, yet everyone understood the reference. He told them that when someone tries to confine your future, the smartest response is to expand your options. That message resonated more deeply than any display of force could have. The momentum shifted gradually but undeniably. Within 2 weeks, a formal letter arrived at the office of the businessman who had arranged the original meeting. It was polite, almost cautious, requesting a renewed discussion under transparent conditions. No locked doors, no ambiguous language, just business. The tone had changed. Fear, once wielded as a tool, had become a liability. The private club realized that their attempt to intimidate had strengthened the resolve of the very community they sought to limit. They had underestimated the quiet infrastructure already in place. When the second meeting occurred, it was held in a neutral location with legal observers present. The conversation was markedly different. There were no veiled references to boundaries, no patronizing smiles. Instead, there was negotiation grounded in law and economics. The property dispute began to move toward resolution, not because prejudice had disappeared, but because it had been cornered by accountability. Bumpy spoke little during that meeting, allowing documents and preparation to speak on his behalf. He understood that the loudest statement he could make was one rooted in lawful confidence. When the session concluded, no doors were locked, no symbolic gestures were made, but something subtle had changed in the balance of power. Harlem had demonstrated that resilience is not reactive, it is strategic. The incident became a quiet legend, not because it involved confrontation, but because it showcased control. In the weeks that followed, partnerships expanded, and the property development proceeded with increased transparency. The community felt not triumphant, but steadier. They had learned that intimidation collapses when it fails to provoke. And the men who once believed they could contain influence behind a locked door began to understand a more unsettling truth. Influence rooted in dignity travels farther than fear ever could.
The detail they never accounted for. Time has a way of revealing what emotion tries to obscure, and as months passed, the real consequence of that locked door surfaced in unexpected ways. The private club that had attempted to assert dominance found itself navigating subtle but persistent complications. Business relationships cooled, invitations grew scarce. The quiet article that had circulated weeks earlier evolved into broader conversations about ethical investment practices and fair access to opportunity. No direct accusations were necessary. Patterns speak loudly when observed closely. Meanwhile, Harlem experienced a period of cautious optimism. The property that had once been a point of contention began to transform into a mixed-use building that provided jobs, storefronts, and office space for emerging entrepreneurs. What had nearly become a symbol of exclusion became instead a marker of persistence. Bumpy did not celebrate publicly, nor did he seek recognition. He remained consistent in his routine: morning reading, structured meetings, calculated decisions. Yet those who observed closely understood that something foundational had shifted. The younger generation saw that restraint did not mean passivity, and that leadership could operate without theatrics. One evening, as Bumpy walked past the nearly completed building, a shop owner approached him quietly and said, "They thought they could shut you in." Bumpy smiled faintly and replied, "They only showed me how much light we needed." That sentence traveled through the neighborhood like a lesson distilled into simplicity. The small detail the opposition had forgotten was not merely that Bumpy had a backup plan, it was that he had a community anchored in preparation. They had assumed individual isolation, overlooking collective strength. They had calculated intimidation without accounting for unity. And unity, once awakened, does not easily return to sleep. The men in that private circle gradually distanced themselves from overt hostility, not out of transformation, but out of pragmatism. Scrutiny had made prejudice expensive. Reputation, once taken for granted, had become fragile. Investors prefer calm waters, and any association with exclusion threatened profitability. In this way, accountability operated not through outrage but through consequence. The most powerful shift, however, occurred internally within Harlem. The story of the locked door became less about confrontation and more about self-mastery. It was retold in barbershops not as a tale of defiance, but as a reminder that composure under pressure amplifies credibility. Churches referenced it in sermons about patience. Parents referenced it when teaching their children about long-term thinking. It became a narrative of control over impulse. Bumpy understood something many never learn. Dignity cannot be granted or revoked by external forces. It is maintained internally and projected outward through behavior. By refusing to validate expectations of volatility, he dismantled a stereotype and replaced it with strategic clarity. Months later, at a community gathering celebrating the opening of the new building, there was no grand speech from Bumpy. He stood in the background as others spoke about opportunity and cooperation. He knew that real victories rarely announce themselves loudly. As evening settled and the lights of the storefronts illuminated the street, the symbolism was unmistakable. A door once locked in arrogance had inadvertently opened a wider path. The incident did not erase prejudice from the world, nor did it eliminate resistance entirely, but it redefined the response. It demonstrated that control is not about dominance, it is about direction. And direction, once established, shapes the future more powerfully than force ever could. The small detail they never accounted for was this: when you attempt to confine a disciplined mind, you reveal your own limitations. Bumpy Johnson had not needed to break down a door. He had simply needed to stand steady long enough for the hinges of arrogance to loosen on their own. And in that steadiness, a community discovered that resilience is not loud, not reckless, and not reactive. It is patient, it is organized, it is deliberate. And when it moves forward. The weight of reputation. Success, when earned through discipline, carries a different weight than success seized through force. As the new building on the contested block officially opened its doors, it stood not merely as brick and mortar, but as a quiet declaration that intimidation had limits. The storefront windows reflected more than passing traffic. They reflected a shift in confidence that Harlem had long cultivated, but rarely displayed so visibly. What began as an attempt to confine influence had evolved into an unintended catalyst for unity, and the ripple effects extended far beyond property lines. Bumpy understood that growth invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites new challenges. With expansion came watchful eyes, some supportive, others calculating. He did not mistake progress for permanence. Instead, he reinforced systems, encouraged mentorship among young entrepreneurs, and insisted that every contract be reviewed twice, every agreement documented clearly, every partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than convenience. He reminded those around him that victories are fragile when built on emotion, but durable when built on structure. Meanwhile, the men who had once locked that door experienced the quieter burden of reputation. They were not publicly condemned in dramatic headlines, yet the absence of overt scandal did not protect them from consequence. Business partners asked careful questions. Social invitations cooled. Investors hesitated before associating with groups rumored to obstruct lawful enterprise. Influence, once wielded confidently, began to feel conditional. What unsettled them most was the realization that their attempted display of control had instead exposed insecurity. They had expected confrontation that would justify their narrative. Instead, they encountered composure that dismantled it. In boardrooms and private conversations, the memory of that locked door lingered not as a victory, but as a miscalculation. Back in Harlem, young leaders began modeling themselves after a different kind of strength. They saw that the most effective response to hostility was preparation, that the most persuasive argument was evidence, and that the most lasting impact came from building institutions rather than winning arguments. Bumpy spent evenings hosting small discussions in community spaces, not to recount his own experience, but to encourage disciplined ambition. He spoke about reputation as a form of currency, explaining that it compounds over time when guarded carefully. He warned that anger, even when justified, can erode credibility if not controlled. His words were not abstract philosophy, they were lessons shaped by lived experience. The story of the locked door gradually transformed from a moment of tension into a framework for resilience. It became a reminder that when someone tries to limit your access, the response should not be to beg entry, but to create alternatives so strong that exclusion becomes irrelevant. That mindset spread quietly but powerfully, influencing business practices, educational goals, and even community organizing. Harlem did not grow louder, it grew steadier. And steadiness, unlike noise, sustains momentum.